Okay. While everybody is coming in, let me just say that we had some interesting discussions in the break, and a couple of points that perhaps I'll make just as we're all sitting down. I talked a lot in my remarks about strategic thinking, and I got a question about what's the difference between strategic thinking and strategic planning. And the answer is that strategic planning is supposed to be a process for doing organized strategic thinking, but often strategic planning becomes sort of a ritual and filling out the forms, and it really doesn't support strategic thinking. So how do you do strategic planning well? I think there's a couple of common, success factors. One is that when you do strategic planning, you need to get kind of the whole team together who's responsible for a particular business, and they need to do the plan together. You can't divide up the work and then have everybody put it together at the end. A strategic plan needs to be the whole management team working together, thinking about the industry, the competitors, the value chain, the positioning, the opportunities, and then ultimately reaching some decisions about direction and then what are the implications for action. I believe it's useful to have an organized, formal strategic planning process, because if you don't sit down to do strategic planning, it gets driven out by pressure for day-to-day. So I think it's a good time to once every year, once every 2 years, I think having an organized process is good. But you can't let it be simply about budgeting and filling out numbers and making guesses about next year's growth rate. So I think planning needs to support the thinking rather than drive it out. So I wanted to talk about that because I know a lot of you are kind of thinking about, should we have a process, what should it look like? And I've written a little bit about that, and you can find some of my writings. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to shift our focus to the country and talk a little bit about Turkey and talk a little bit about where Turkey has been as an economy and where Turkey is going and where Turkey needs to go. And once again, I want to declare in the beginning, now I know I actually can buy Turkey stock because there's an index fund, on the Turkish Stock Exchange. So right now I only have one Turkish stock. You can guess which one that is. And I'm soon to have 2 Turkish stocks. But the second one is going to depend on all of you because it's going to be an index. Okay, so you better do a good job. You better have listened to my presentation. But I'm very, very optimistic about Turkey, not only from the corporate sector, but also from the economic sector. And so I want to start there, but I also want to make the case that there's a lot of work to do. That although you made a lot of progress since 2001, we'll see that. The things you've done are the relatively easier things to the things that stand ahead of you. So, and in order to take the next step, the next stage, I think it's going to require more involvement from the private sector. And one of my dreams is that coming out of this meeting, there'll be a tremendous opportunity for the private sector to step up and start to play a role, not so much in just running your own company, but also driving forward the country, the provinces, the regions in which you're operating, and so forth. I think that's really the next step. The next step is going to demand, it's going to require, it's going to need your help in the private sector. But let's see if we can understand kind of the strategic position facing the country from an economic point of view and start to kind of at least identify the agenda. I'm not the one to design the specific action process. You are. But I think we can hopefully all agree on some common agenda and start to move that agenda forward. So whenever you're trying to understand a country's economy, again, you always have to start the same way you start with a business. You've got to really look at the performance and see what that performance tells you and the insights that it gives you really about how the country has been doing, but also kind of what some of the issues may be. And again, you've all seen, you all know this, but this is just looking at Turkey's performance over quite a long term, breaking it into some logical time periods. And you can see that the country has had a long history of being a relatively slow growth economy in terms of GDP per capita, which is the single measure of prosperity. You see the history, you see the volatility of this early period. You've lived through all this, you know all this. And of course, what we see starting in 2001 is a very pretty picture. The curve shifted in a rather fundamental way. So this is a very good sign. It's a very good sign. Having said that, despite the fact that we've grown a lot faster in the last 6 or 7 years, you're still kind of in the middle of the pack. You're not an extraordinarily rapid growth country, even in this recent period. There are lots of other countries that are growing just as fast, and you're still pretty far down the income scale, 12,700 roughly GDP per capita. That's still very much middle, lower middle income. So yes, we should be very proud of the recent history. Got a long way to go. Particularly since we've got fundamental issues having to do with getting your citizens employed. If you compare Turkey in terms of unemployment performance to other countries, it's not a pretty picture. And at least according to this data, which is maybe partly a little bit biased by the specific years, but the data says it's actually not getting better. We've ramped up growth, but we're not employing enough people. Part of that's because it's a young population, it's a rapidly growing population, but we're not generating enough jobs and enough exciting companies and enough growth in the economy. You all know that. You may be less familiar with how unusual Turkey is in terms of participation of Turkish citizens in the workforce, in the labor force. Again, part of this is the young population, but this is very striking. And again, what it says is that it's actually getting a little worse. And the price in terms of GDP per capita is huge. If we can get more Turkish citizens involved in the economy, it's going to have a tremendously positive force on the GDP per capita, because GDP per capita is the output of the economy divided by the number of people. And if we can get more people in the economy, then the GDP per capita goes up just as a matter of mathematics. So, as in terms of the strategic challenge facing the country, here we are. This is one of the strategic challenges. Now, as Turkey has gone through this ramping up of growth, we've seen a pretty good picture in terms of exports. We tend to divide exports into categories. We tend to separate the processed goods from the unprocessed goods, the goods from the services. Turkey's been fairly volatile on services because that's heavily driven by tourism and things that are quite volatile. You see a nice steady increase in the processed goods, the goods that involve more processing and more technology, kind of a continued low-level decline in the kind of natural resource type goods. This is a good thing. This is a good picture compared to other countries. I look at a lot of these pictures. This is a good picture. The problem is that exports are still too low. As a percent of your economy, exports are very, very modest in Turkey. You can see, I don't think, some of the countries are low because they're huge countries. Other countries, however, given your size, you should be exporting a lot more. And again, you're not increasing exports as a percent of your economy. It's actually gone down a little bit. And that suggests that the growth has been heavily domestic. It's not been driven by exports. Now that's good right now because of the global economic crisis. But it's really bad in the long run. Any country that wants to grow, particularly that has to absorb so many people into the economy, needs to have rapid domestic growth, and it has to build export capacity. And it has to learn to import things that it does not produce productively to drive productivity growth in the economy. I took out the slide about import, but imports into Turkey are very low. Turkey's trying to do too much and doing things that are not very efficient. And that's not a good place to be for our future. It's been okay in the past. Things are definitely better, but we've got to move beyond that. Foreign investment is up, but it's really low for a country of Turkey's size. We need foreign capital. We need it because we need the capital. We need it because we need the technology. We need it because we need the access to distribution channels. We need foreign investment very badly. We've got a great team. It's really getting better. It was really bad in the past. It's getting better, but we're still at a very low level. Even if you look at the recent progress, we're still way down. And this is a sign that there's something not quite competitive enough in the Turkish environment, in the Turkish economy, to attract quite enough companies, despite the fact that you have a very large, rapidly growing population, and despite the fact that you are strategically located in a very interesting region. You have some real advantages in attracting investment that other countries would die to have. But we haven't been able to quite get it together yet. And by the way, I love the Foreign Investment Agency. I love the director of that agency. They're doing a great job, but they can't do it alone. There's broader issues that have to be addressed. And that's kind of part of the strategic challenge facing the economy. And finally, just to give a snapshot of performance, we have not achieved innovative output in Turkey. If you look at patenting rates, which are not perfect, but they're comparable across countries, and you can really look at these. We've done a lot of work on these over the years. Turkey is barely registering in terms of technological output, despite the fact that you have good engineers, despite the fact that you have a lot of very well internationally trained people. This is not translated into the capacity to kind of drive intellectual innovation output in terms of new technology. We're not seeing very many international companies put their science and technology work here. That's not what they're putting here. They're putting other kind of things here. Given the quality of the people, given the quality of the talent here, that shouldn't be the case. This should be the development center for the whole region. Turkey should be the development center for the whole region. It's not yet getting those kind of investments. It's not sprouting those kind of investments. And of course, until you raise the scientific level and the technical level of the economy, you can't support that very high GDP per capita that you should aspire to. Turkey has a lot of strengths. It's doing better. It has now to take the next big leap from a competitiveness point of view. Lots of things have gotten better. The results show it. You've opened. You've improved your macro policy. The infrastructure is dramatically better. Lots of things have happened, but wow, now we've got to go to stage 2. And stage 2 is complicated and challenging, and it's going to require more strategy, and it's going to require more of you. It's going to require more business community involvement, engagement, and also participation. Many of the things that are required to improve Turkish competitiveness, the business community can do itself. It can't wait or expect government to handle it. So we need to step up. We need to step up. And I say this because, again, I've had the privilege of working with a whole bunch of other countries at this part of their development process. And this is a characteristic that is literally sort of 100% true. If you're going to drive the economy to the next level at this stage, you've got to get the private sector involved. Doesn't work otherwise, unless you discover, so much oil that, we can all go home. But again, what we found is even rich natural resources don't produce wealth. Venezuela has a lot of resources, Saudi Arabia has a lot of resources, they're not wealthy. They think they are, that's the problem. That's one of the reasons why their economies are going nowhere. All right, so how do we do it? What's the strategy look like? How do we set priorities? What's the sequence of steps that have to take place in Turkey? How do we answer that question? Well, we have to, again, understand another set of principles. There's one set of principles that really drive the competitive success of a company. There's a related but different set of principles that drive the competitiveness of a location, a country, a region. And we've got to have a common understanding in Turkey of what those are. The number one obstacle to competitiveness improvement I see around the world is the lack of a common understanding of what it takes to win. Country after country I work in, people fight about what they should do because they don't agree on what it takes to win. Some people think it's to have low wages, and other people think it's to have government subsidies. Another group of people think something else. We've got to get a consensus about the core principles of competitiveness. In fact, I would go one step further. To be a really successful country, you've got to get this understanding of the core principles to be something that is taken as a given by every political party. If you're fighting over the core economic principles, it's very hard to drive your competitiveness agenda. You've got to get to a point where the left and the right and the center, they fight about many things, but not about the core economic principles of how to drive the country forward. Again, we see that in a lot of the successful countries. So actually, politics has a lot to do with economics and competitiveness as well. Competitiveness, then, is fundamentally driven by productivity, by the ability to take your labor, your capital, your natural endowments, and generate value. A lot of output per day, a lot of output per dollar or lira invested. That's what defines competitiveness. If Turkey's going to get wealthier, it has to be more productive. And of course, it has to get more citizens being part of the productive machine. That's the simple, basic logic of competitiveness. It's even more important in the global economy. Because unless you're productive, nobody's going to do anything here. Or they're not going to do the things that you want them to do. Competitiveness is not having low wages. Having low wages is a sign that you're not competitive. Again, you'd be surprised how much confusion there is about that very simple point. We don't want low wages in Turkey. We want high wages in Turkey. We've got to create the circumstances where we can actually earn those high wages. That's the fundamental challenge facing the country. We've got to do everything we can to rip away all the obstacles to being productive, to driving value. Anything that gets in the way of that has to stop. Because it's literally taking the standard of living away from the people. Often when you think of it that way, some of these policies and practices that countries have, seem different, But basically anything that makes the country less productive is actually reducing the standard of living. And we've got to see it that way. And we've got to get citizens to see it that way. so they don't request the wrong thing or vote for the wrong things in a false view of what will benefit them. Again, it's a tragedy in most countries that the political process is fighting over things that actually make the country less competitive, and rather than agreeing on things that make it more competitive. A couple of key points here. I won't go through all of these. To be competitive, it really doesn't matter what you do. You can operate in any part of the economy. You can be in agriculture, you can be in textiles, you can be in apparel, you can be in tourism, you can be in high tech, you can be in low tech, you can be in medium tech. Doesn't matter what part of the economy you're in. What matters is how productive you are. Let's take tourism. You can be in tourism, and if your quality isn't good, and if your infrastructure isn't good, and if your service isn't good, then you can get $100 a day per tourist. Or you can be in tourism, have wonderful quality, wonderful service, wonderful hotels, and you can get $1,000 a day per tourist. You can get rich in tourism, you can be poor in tourism. It's not whether you're in tourism that's going to determine your success. It's how. Now, what does this mean? What this means is that you should never abandon any industry. You should make it more productive. And as we'll see later, the way we grow new businesses in the economy is we make the old businesses better. And then those give rise to new businesses and new businesses and new businesses. That's the way it really works. We can't just dream about being in high tech or dream about making airplanes. We have to build skills, capabilities, and that's the process. That is a long process. That's what competitiveness is all about. Competitiveness is built on some building blocks. This is kind of the latest version of these building blocks that we have developed, kind of a new model that hopefully next year will be the new model for the Global Competitiveness Report. And this has been a 2 or 3 year effort with a lot of statistical work to kind of build a framework that we can actually measure and test given available data. Competitiveness starts with your natural endowment. Any natural resources you have, your people, your location in the world, your proximity to other places, your logistical efficiency because of closeness to the ocean and things like that. So you have natural endowments. That's kind of your base level. On top of that, you create what we call macroeconomic competitiveness, which has to do with kind of the broad framework conditions in the economy. And then on top of that, you have to build a microeconomic competitiveness, which has to do with the capabilities and skills and assets actually in the economy itself. Again, we don't have a lot of time, but just let's go very quickly. So there's the social infrastructure and political institutions that have to do with basic human development, health, education, rule of law, political and governmental efficiency and effectiveness, macro policy, you all understand this, sophistication of companies. You can't have a competitive country without sophisticated companies that use good managerial practices and operating practices. You need a good business environment in order to allow companies to operate productively with the right inputs, with the right rules, with the right regulations. And finally, you need what we call clusters. I'll talk about this later. Clusters are where you have not just one company, but a whole lot of companies in the same field, and you can capture synergies and productivity improvements by the combination of companies, not just individual companies. These are the building blocks. These are things that we have been measuring and benchmarking across countries in the world. So let's continue. So in terms of looking at the business environment, there's a kind of a framework that I introduced some years ago called the Diamond Framework, and that talks about how do we understand the business environment? What has to improve to allow productivity to grow? And the answer is that you have to improve the inputs, the quality of your infrastructure, your skills, and so forth. You've got to create the right rules of competition so that the winners win because they're more productive, not because they can dominate the market or control the market. You've got to improve the quality of the demand, the sophistication of the customer, the demanding needs that must be met in the country. You've got to create the supporting industries. The big message you should take away from this is to build competitiveness in the business environment, many different things matter. Hundreds of things matter. You can't do it with one step or two steps or one law or two laws. It's got to be a long-term process of kind of making lots of things better and more supportive of productivity. That's the process of building competitiveness. Clusters have to do with building the critical mass in particular fields in the economy. This is just a simple example of a cluster. This is a tourism cluster. This one happens to be in Australia. A cluster is all the related and supporting industries necessary, or many of them, to actually produce the output in that particular field. So in tourism, of course, you need to have, the ocean, the attractions, the history, the things to see, the things to do, but that's not enough. In tourism, you've also got to have, places to stay, and places to eat, and local transportation, and travel agents, and so on, and so on, and so on. And by the way, you also need, in a cluster, you also need the training organizations that build skills in that field, and the industry groups that organize the field. And we see this in field after field after field, and location after location after location. Where you're really competitive, you can't do it if you just have one or two companies trying to do everything themselves. You need to build clusters. You can run the best hotel in the world. You can run the best hotel in the world, but if the other parts of the cluster don't do their job, you'll fail. Doesn't matter how well your hotel is run. That's the concept of clusters. Every business is like that. And as the economy of the world has opened more and more, we see more and more success being concentrated in clusters, in particular locations. Turkey has clusters. We'll talk about that later. To build a cluster takes a long time. This is the wine cluster in Australia. Australia, about 15 years ago, had basically zero exports in wine. Zero exports about 15 years ago. As of last year, and I'll get to it in a second, as of last year they exported $2.5 billion of wine. They went from zero to $2.5 billion of exports. How did that happen? It happened through a long process of building capabilities. Research institutes, recruiting foreign experts, getting foreign investment, creating winemaking schools, creating the right regulatory agencies, organizing the private sector, building collaborative organizations. Boom! $2.5 billion in exports. That's how you build competitiveness. That's how you build high productivity. Australian wine is enormously high quality. It's produced very, very productively. The yield per acre, per hectare of grapes is very high. The grapes are of enormous quality. The winemaking skills are outstanding. That's why they now support high value and tremendous exports. That's the process of building competitiveness. It's not about passing a law at the government. Look at how deeply involved the private sector is in building competitiveness. This is mostly a private sector story. The government helped. The government did the right job in facilitating this process. The private sector drove that process. And that's the way it always is. That's the way it always is. The way an economy grows is you start by having some existing products, maybe because of your natural resources, maybe because of luck, maybe because of history, and then you turn products into clusters, And then you deepen clusters, and then you build related clusters. That's the way economies develop competitiveness and high levels of productivity. Here's an example from the region of around San Diego, California, where, again, I've had the privilege of working with some of the leaders there in terms of building this economy, which is now very, very advanced and very sophisticated. You know, it all started with climate and geography. And then they were fortunate enough to attract the U.S. Navy to put a major base in the city. And those two triggers started a process. And you can see that process took decades. And now they're a world-class center of IT, of biotech, of medical devices. But it was all building one step on the next and building one capability, and then that leading to new opportunities and new opportunities. That's the way economies grow. That's the way competitiveness gets built. It doesn't get built by top-down government leadership. It gets built by bottoms-up evolution with government playing the right role in the process. We see this over and over again. As we look at an economy and we look at all the clusters in the economy, we see that there's overlap and interrelationships across clusters. If you have a situation in oil and gas and you have some oil and gas resources, what we know is that your best opportunity is not going to grow next into financial services. Your best opportunity from here will be to build a chemical and then build into plastics. It tends to go in this direction because these clusters share technologies, they share expertise, they share supplier bases. So when we look at economies, we see countries growing not in a random way. We see countries growing in a very predictable way given the linkages across the various businesses in the economy. I'll show you the Turkey picture in a moment. Couple other key principles. In a large country like Turkey, many of the most important drivers of competitiveness are not at the national level. They're at the regional, provincial, local level. Competitiveness is not even across countries. It's very, very, often very, very different in different locations, even within the same country. And we tend to see a lot of specialization of the sub-national economies, the provincial economies in this case. This just gives you an example of how different even our cities and states are within the United States. They have totally different economies. And that's good because that creates a lot of specialization, and each part of the country works in areas where it can get very, very good. And you don't have everybody doing the same thing. And we have tremendous trade within the U.S., which makes productivity go up. And we have tremendous competition across states to see who can do a better job. The bigger the country, the more critical it is that you have really a provincial or regional strategy together with your national strategy. Because that's the way you get this tremendous power in terms of driving productivity growth in the economy. And I have a slide here, and I'm going to, again, what I'm going to do with these slides is Turkcell will post them, and I will post them at Harvard on my website. So anybody's happy to have these slides. I would love for you to download them and look at them because I'm going very, very quickly given the time. So fundamentally, competitiveness is got to be seen as a multi-level process. And of course, Turkey has a really big agenda here, huge, to deal with the tremendous gaps between the different parts of the countries. That is going to be critical to your ability to ultimately be successful. And so is your neighborhood. Again, competitiveness is very, very strongly influenced by the ability to coordinate economically with neighboring countries and achieve efficiencies and synergies and to really open up trade and investment by opening those doors, those economic doors. You improve competitiveness by working with your neighbors in really three ways. Number one, you open trade and investment. Your most natural trading partners are your immediate neighbors because they're close, because they often have similar needs, because you often understand them better. Your most natural way to internationalize is, again, in your region, because you bring something different and unique potentially to competing there rather than trying to go to Europe and fight it out with the French or the Germans. Working with your neighbors also can allow you to improve the business environment, improve the logistical flows, improve the energy efficiency and energy utilization, connect the financial markets together, harmonize the telecom so that people can move around and be in touch. There's all kinds of ways in which you can capture synergies in improving the economy by collaborating with neighbors. And of course, all of you know, this is a tremendous opportunity for Turkey. This is one of the big game changers. This is one of the things that's going to make Turkey really very, very unique. If you can actually pull this off, you're off to a very exciting what's happening here. Economically, you know, politics, fine. Economics, this is economics. It's not just politics. Now, in order to do all this stuff that I've been talking about, you need a strategy. There are probably 1,000 different policies that have to be changed. Maybe 2,000, maybe 3,000, in order to increase competitiveness. You can't do that at one time. You can't do that in 1 week. You can't do that in 1 year. There's not enough people to do it. Therefore, you need a strategy. You need to set a sequence of priorities that can be implemented, which reflect the constraints and how they evolve over time on your productivity. And, you know, Turkey, I think, is off to a good start from an economic strategy point of view, but we got to be much clearer, I think, and much more strategic going forward, because the things that have to improve now are challenging. And even Turkey doesn't have enough money to do all these things at once. So the question is, what order do we proceed in? That becomes the challenge. And we'll talk later about, you know, how do we understand our kind of national value proposition? How do we understand our role in the world? Where the Turkish economy could be 5 or 10 or 20 years from now? What would be unique about it? We don't want to copy any other country. It's just like business strategy. Imitation doesn't work. We've got to figure out how to harness what's different about us, and we've got to create new advantages that are going to reinforce that. And in order to do that, we've got to work differently as a country. No more top-down, government-driven economic policy. We've got to have bottoms-up and top-down. We've got to have everybody collaborating. That's the way modern economic development looks. That is just beginning in Turkey. We need to make a tremendous jump in that area. These are the fundamental principles. Again, forgive me for going so quickly. Every one of these areas is a whole class, a whole book. But this is kind of the essence of what has to happen if you're going to build a competitive Turkey. And again, I couldn't resist talking about my friend here. Companies have a fundamental influence on that. Companies, by where they choose to locate, by how they think about their role in the communities in which they're operating, can have a fundamental impact on economic development of the country. And this is just some wonderful choices that Turkcell made to put some facilities in other parts of Turkey. Might have seemed crazy at the time, but they've enhanced their competitiveness at the same time as they've enhanced the region's competitiveness, and they've driven economic growth in some much poorer parts of the country. And this story needs to be repeated many, many, many more times over the coming years. This is how Turkey is going to transform itself. It's going to be companies and leaders like you behaving differently, thinking differently, locating differently, collaborating differently. That's the challenge facing Turkey. So let's now take the principles and apply them, and let's look at the data and see what we conclude here. Again, I consider myself well prepared for this lecture, but don't get me wrong. I am no deep expert on Turkey. So what I'm trying to give you is, a thinking process. I'm not claiming that we have all the answers. We have to create the answers. You have to create the answers. But I want to take you a few steps down the road, and then hopefully we can take the next steps together. So productivity is fundamental to competitiveness, right? How are we doing on productivity? Pretty good. In terms of productivity growth, Turkey's been doing pretty well. Particularly recently, what we've done here is we've looked at productivity growth over really almost a 20-year period, mediocre. But if we look at productivity growth over the recent period, we're now up in the more attractive area. Notice that productivity growth is almost exactly the same as prosperity growth. If you remember the earlier slide, that's not an accident. That's the way it is. That's the way it works. Okay? It's productivity growth and the ability to bring new people into the economy. That's what drives your prosperity. Now, let's look at some more data. If we look at productivity growth or prosperity growth over time, you can see that there was a tremendous mess in the late 90s. Productivity wasn't growing, it was shrinking in a number of years. Since 2001, productivity growth is positive. Look, though, we haven't really made much of an impact on labor participation yet. And productivity growth is decelerating even before, 08 and 09. So this says that we got a surge of productivity growth by taking some important steps. The question is, what are the next steps to renew the productivity growth? And how can we drive things such that we can actually absorb more people? Look at this. We haven't replaced the people that got pulled out of the economy even during this good period. And that's why the participation has gone down. And that's why the unemployment rate has gone up. See, that's the mathematics of prosperity. These are the equations that you have to impact. Taking all those factors that drive competitiveness, the building blocks, this kind of gives us the sort of overall snapshot. And it might be a little surprising to some of you. These are rankings that we do from the Global Competitiveness Report. Now, let me be very clear. This was not in the Global Competitiveness Report this year. Because the report this year, because of the instability, was done with the old model. This is data that I've done with our new model, and I'm just sharing it with you. It's not secret. But this was not what was actually in the report. So let me be clear, because if you go look in the report, you won't see this. Our model showed that Turkey was ranked number 57 out of 128 countries in terms of GDP per capita. So that's where you were in terms of prosperity. Of the 128 countries we rank, which are all the important countries, in GDP per capita you were 57. On competitiveness, you were 64. You can see that on the macro side, you're worse. Now, when I talk to Turks, a lot of them say, gee, we've made huge progress on macro policy. You have made huge progress. If you saw these numbers 5 years ago, you'd be like embarrassed. They'd be horrible. You've made huge progress. But fundamentally, and I said this to you earlier, let me get this pointer, Turkish companies are more competitive than the Turkish business environment is more competitive than the Turkish macro environment. And fundamentally, we got to change this. We got to catch up. We got to get this stuff right. Now look at macro policy. Macro policy's gotten much better. But it's this stuff that is critical. The way the political institutions work, the effectiveness of government organizations, the rule of law, the human development, which has to do with education and health, that's a critical challenge. And the country, I think, is in a good position finally to get over that over the coming years. But let's not think that the macro part's over and it's all micro now. The macro part's not over. Nor is the micro part, but the macro part is surely not over. I actually think this number is too good. I actually don't think Turkish companies are quite this competitive. But at least we can be happy that we got the number, you know? And hopefully we can keep the number over time. This number sometimes is affected by kind of people's moods, you know, when we do surveys, and so. But you know, I think the general principle is true. The companies are a little bit better than the environment, that are better than the macro context. Okay, so let's dig in. Let's dig deeper. On macro, some very important things have gotten better. This is really important. Countries at this level of income often have debilitating problems of corruption, and this country, at least the independent data shows that things are getting better. Still in the middle, still too low, getting better. So that's progress. Macro monetary policy, progress. Fiscal policy, some progress. Not quite enough. Human development, big challenge. If we take our GDP per capita, that ranks in this report, it's confusing, in this report that ranks at 63, Human Development Report. But unfortunately, you can see our Human Development Index is 79. That means our human development is behind our income. Life expectancy, which is a health measure, even higher. Education index, even higher. So this kind of gives you a flavor for how we would benchmark, you know, our kind of economic results with some of these basic human conditions. This is a problem. We have to change these. These are hard to change. They take time. So we can't relax. We can't think that political reform is finished. We can't think that governmental improvement is finished. We can't think that. We can't think that for a second. We've got to move on. You know, gender issues are pretty good in Turkey, getting better. But even there, again, based on these data, which are imperfect, we've got a ways to go. On macro, the really big issues have to do with improving the political institutions, the independence of the central bank, stuff like that, getting the tax system working more effectively. I'm not even going to talk about it because I'll get everybody here upset. It's horrible in every way. It's working heavily against competitiveness. Got to fix it. You know, kind of getting the political stability. Lots of good progress here. This is exhilarating, the progress you've made here. Improving the quality of government. We got bureaucracies in government that they're not Egyptian, but they're pretty bureaucratic. And we've got some great people at the top now, but the depth of the public service in this country needs fixing. It's not they're bad people. It's just that they have the wrong mindset, the wrong mentality, the wrong political laws that govern civil service and so forth. And then, of course, we've got this enormous challenge of rebuilding and restructuring the education and healthcare delivery system. You've made progress, you've put a lot of money into it, that's great, but the data shows us we've got a long way to go. So part of our strategy has to be to deal with this stuff. And deal with it as, you know, in the right sequence and at a level that we can actually afford. On the company side, I found the big companies are variable, but in general quite good. The small companies are way behind. We've had very little systematic program to really build up the capabilities of small and medium-sized enterprise, bring companies into the formal sector. There's really no coherent policy here. There's efforts, it's getting better, there's more coordination, but so far we haven't gotten there. You can read some of the other things. Company sector, again, lots of work, pretty good. Next step is going to be challenging. This looks at the business environment. There are many aspects of the business environment. By and large, we've got our domestic logistical system and decent and good communication system in place. It's not 100% complete, but it's much better. We've improved the starting of new businesses from a regulatory point of view. We've opened up to foreign investment, moderated the tariff barriers, more and more competition coming into the economy, although far from enough in terms of rivalry domestically. Local supplier base is getting there. IT policies are getting there. Financial system is improving. Not great, but improving. Weaknesses are substantial. We talked about the tax system already. You can read down that list. I would be shocked if any of you were surprised with any of these. But let me just give you a few examples of the actual ranking of Turkey. Let's see. Get on the right page here. Patents per million population. You're ranked 91 out of the 128 countries. Protection of minority shareholders, 97. Gosh, I'm glad I'm not a minority shareholder. Venture capital availability, 95. Burden of customs procedures, 96. Cooperation in labor relations, 91. Intellectual property protection, 101. Efficiency of governance of corporate boards, 108. Market disruption from state-owned enterprises, 115. Okay, so every country has weaknesses. Every country has issues. Every country's always trying to make these things better. What we need here, of course, is a strategy. We can't do all this overnight. We can't do all this at once. We have to kind of make some rankings here, and we have to figure out how to proceed to tackle these issues. Until we do, it's going to be hard to really drive competitiveness. This is the World Bank Doing Business report. The advantage of it is it's done extremely consistently. It's hard data across countries. Again, this is a different ranking of a different set of countries. In this ranking, 185 countries, Turkey is 57. You can see that since the big countries and good countries are all in, the rankings are always around the same because the people that are ahead of us are the same people every time. We've kind of sorted out contracts, registering property, starting a business. We look pretty good. That was on the earlier list. Protecting investors, not minority interests, but investors, pretty good. But then the red starts. Hard to employ workers, hard to deal with licenses, hard to pay closed businesses, and so forth. Again, this has got to be then our next chapter. We've got to go from the broad reforms to now more detailed reforms. This is why people aren't coming to Turkey. It's not because there's not smart people here. It's not because the workers aren't hardworking. They're not coming because they're not finding the right business environment. This is not a low-cost place to do business. It's got to be a high-value place to do business, and it's got to be a high-productivity place to do business, and we've got a ways to go. We're working. I want to acknowledge the progress that's been made. Don't get me wrong. There has been progress. The question is how much, and where do we go from here, and how strategic can we be? This is the country's cluster portfolio, the export cluster portfolio. Again, this will not surprise any of you. This is based on the very kind of detailed analytic that we do with trade statistics and cluster mapping. You know, some big clusters that are, all the clusters to the right of this line during this period, which is 20 years, have been gaining market share in the world. This is actually a nice picture. Again, I look at a lot of these pictures. This is a nice picture because you've got a lot of clusters that are gaining market share. So in that sense, you're moving in the right direction. But the problem we have is that a lot of these clusters where we're big are not very, we're not producing very advanced high-value products. Or we're not producing products that are advanced and high-value enough. And therefore, and we're not being productive enough to grow fast enough to employ all these citizens. We've got to then not change this picture, but we've got to actually change a lot of the details of what we do in each of these areas. And we've got to bring some of the lower size and growth ones up on the picture. If you look at where on the economy map we fall, the dark greens are where we have quite a high world share, over 3%. And then the lighter the green, they're still strong, but they're less strong. And then the white are where we really have no substantial world market share. And you can see that we're kind of on the edge. We haven't yet built those kind of collections of interdependent strengths. We haven't done that yet. You've got a good foundation. A lot of countries don't have many clusters. They don't have much to build on. You've got a lot to build on. Now the question is to build it. To improve the technology, to improve the skill, to improve the regulation, to improve the branding, to improve the customer service, and so on and so on and so on. And that's got to be done really through a collaborative process if you're going to do it quickly. So we've got to mobilize clusters in Turkey rather than just have them grow up by accident. We've got to organize the companies in these fields to actually work together to kind of improve the environment. This is an example of quite a well-developed cluster in Turkey that's quite competitive. And you can see, you know, you've got a lot of depth here. A lot of depth in supporting industries and educational programs. This is what we need to build across the whole economy. Across the whole economy. We need to build more of these. Again, an assessment. Cluster development is going to be critical to Turkey because, number one, it's how you upgrade sophistication. Number two, it's how you bring the small and medium-sized companies together into the process. It's also how you think about regional development. It's also how you think about regional development. Here's an example in automotive. We have a good position in automotive, but the real strength is in assembly. And look at we're doing okay, but you know, the real opportunity for Turkey is not just to have that big assembly bubble, but to drive the whole cluster up. To build the depth of supporting industries, which often involve more advanced technology. And develop the capability and the platform here to do more of that in Turkey. And that actually will end up making our assembly even more competitive. Because they'll have better access to supporting industries. That's the process of building competitiveness. Now, I mentioned earlier that another really fundamental issue facing the country is the tremendous variability of economic performance of the provinces and cities. And, you know, there's Istanbul, way up there on the left. And then there's all of this. The unweighted average of Turkey's GDP per capita is 4,888. So if you just take the average of all the provinces, that's what you get. Of course, the actual GDP per capita is 12,750 or something. So you can see we have this tremendous weight of areas that are not economically doing well. And this then becomes a fundamental strategic issue for the economy. We've started with regional development authorities. We've started tentatively, very, very tentatively, we've started to put some more authority and more focus on the provincial level. We've improved the infrastructure a lot, which is a really important step in building up a more diverse set of competitive economies inside the country. We got a long, long way to go here. And this is one of the top priorities in Turkish economic strategy. We've done a little cluster mapping in Turkey, not we, you, and I thought just you'd be interested in knowing kind of where the economic strengths are. This is what we want. You want specialization. You want each province to develop its own strengths and not try to copy what the other guys are doing. A lot of countries make the mistake of they want every province to have one of each, rather than to allow specialization and trade within the country, the kind of allocation of activity to where it's most efficient. And hopefully in Turkey we can avoid the mistakes and pursue the right path. And there's a big agenda here. Part of this agenda is going to be to keep improving the infrastructure. The best way to develop regions is to make the regions very efficiently able to trade and exchange and move around people and ideas and with each other. And the more we do that, the more this country will really become an integrated, diversified but integrated economy. And you can see some other points. And then, of course, there's the neighborhood. This is an opportunity that is hard to overestimate. You know, given the sheer number of people living around you, given your unique relationships with many of those countries, given your heritage, given your history, given the the Islamic connections, given the level at which Turkish managers are able to operate effectively in these kind of countries that are a little bit challenging sometimes, probably because Turkey used to be pretty challenging too. And so here is a tremendous economic strength that will be complicated because these countries are unstable and so forth, but it will be a huge opportunity. You know, most countries would die for the neighborhood that you're in. You know, poor Chile in Latin America, you know. Great country, great policies, awful neighbors. Not awful as people, awful as economies. Therefore, they give up. So they have to trade with Europe, you know, and Asia. And they don't get that natural process of kind of building their economy around their neighborhood. This is something that we here luckily don't have to do. I don't have an economic strategy for Turkey. You're going to have to create one. The process goes like this. We really try to understand objectively what is unique about this country. I've just started the list. It's a very unique country. That's good. You have multiple unique strengths to build upon. And you can add to this list. And then we ask ourselves, given this, what's our value proposition? Where can we play? What kind of fields are our natural opportunities. What do we already have that we can build on? What then do we need to really, really get right in terms of our strategy, our investment, our policy focus? And again, I've just put a few things on the right-hand side, not to be meant to be definitive or exhaustive, but just simply to get the list started. The macro stuff is, of course, crucial. The workforce will be a constraint, so we've got to work on that. You know, the physical infrastructure to connect our provinces and connect us to these neighbors is really important. There's a lot of stuff that falls out of these unique strengths. We've got to develop a strategy. Government is starting to do a better job of coordinating within government. There's the beginnings of these kind of dialogues underway, but nothing yet that I would call a real national strategy. And of course, we not only need national strategies, we need a provincial strategy in every single province. And we need somebody there in the governmental role that has the capacity and the expertise to actually deliver and implement the strategy. And we're a long way from that. We're even farther from that than we are at the national level. A lot of the national leaders, I think, are very good. In order to move to action, I believe the private sector is now going to have to step up. You can see how big a job all this is. You can see how much there is to be done. You can see how it's not just at the national policy level, it's at the cluster level, it's at the provincial level, it's at the dealing with each individual neighbor level. There's a gigantic agenda. The private sector has to step up and be part of the process. The process of cluster initiatives, the process of provincial competitiveness councils, and perhaps even a national council, to organize the collective weight of the private sector to encourage and support government as government tries to do what it needs to do. Well, that is a first chapter of a discussion about the future of Turkey and its economy. Again, I want to finish where I started. This country has enormous, enormous potential to be one of those countries that 20 years from now we all look at and we say, my gosh, what an incredible story. And look at what you could do for the world. Look at what you could do for the region. If a country with Islamic roots in this neighborhood could drive economic prosperity, not only here, but in the entire neighborhood, this would be a contribution of world proportions. So the question is, you know, are we kind of ready to kind of take this next set of steps? Are you, as private sector leaders, ready to get involved? I'm sensing that you are. I'm sensing that the governmental leaders that I've met get it. I'm sensing that the circumstances are right, and that's frankly one of the reasons I'm here. So, but now it's kind of up to you. And as I promised my dear student, I'm thrilled to kind of be part of this process if I can be helpful. So with that, let me thank you for your wonderful attention. Please read the slides, but you know, we're just starting this discussion. So thank you.
Hepinize çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Dediğimiz gibi gerçekten uzun yolculuk, çok başarılı işler yaptık. Fakat daha yapacak çok işimiz var. Hep beraber çalışacağız ve fark yaratacağız. Çok teşekkürler, iyi günler.